So least effort is key here. And the other thing you can tell is that riskiest assumption is also key. And it turns out your risky assumption will naturally change as you go about validating risky assumptions. So you'll take your riskiest assumption, you'll validate that, and then you'll move on to the next risky assumption and the next one. And each time you'll be finding the least effortful way to test that risky assumption. So what that means is that if you start off like testing one risky assumption, which is, do people want help solving the problem that your product ostensibly solves? You could end up having one type of MVP. Maybe that's ads or cold emails for B2B plays. So if you have a different risky assumption, like, okay, so we've confirmed that people want help solving the problem, they want your help solving the problem, will they pay you to solve the problem? That can be a different kind of risky assumption. So for that, there would be a different type of MVP. Here you might use landing pages or slide decks or videos or pre-sales or letter of intents. So once you go and validate this with an MVP, then you would move on to another risky assumption. Like, okay, so we've proven that we can pay, people will pay, but can we actually solve the problem? In that case, you'd use a different type of MVP. You'd build a manual solution to the problem. And then the same goes for the next step. So, well, can you find product market fit? Again, a different style of MVP comes into play here. Now we actually automate the solution. We build a beta product. So it's only here that we start building our a beta of a version, a piece of software. So you can see that each type of risky assumption has a different type of MVP that you use, because each of these are the least effortful way to test this risky assumption. All right, so you can see now that you will have multiple MVPs. You must, because the least effortful way to test a risky assumption changes based on the risky assumption. So you're going to have multiple MVPs. And in fact, you're going to have one for every risky assumption. So if you think about it, like, okay, so for every risky assumption, I'm going to have a different MVP. All of a sudden, an MVP looks a lot like a test. Because you're going to have a risky assumption. Okay, I got to find a way to go and test it. So that will be one MVP, and then my next test will be another MVP and another MVP. So an MVP is simply a test. We can actually simplify this even more, taking this sort of just notion of like, hey, it's just a test. It's a certain type of test, but it's just a test. We can simplify it to say an MVP is the simplest version of a product that tests your riskiest assumption. The simplest version of a product that tests your riskiest assumption. All right, so now you know the definition of MVP. You know that MVP is not synonymous with beta. You know there are different types of MVPs, and you know that you are going to have multiple MVPs throughout your journey to product market fit. There are some things that I haven't told you though. Things like, what is your risky assumption? Like, how do you figure out which assumption of yours is riskiest? I also haven't told you which MVP to build, because if you don't know which is your riskiest assumption, you don't know which MVP to build. And then finally, I haven't told you how to actually build those things, so how to build the MVPs. But I want to give you a quick hint. All right, so we know that there's this relationship between risky assumptions and MVPs. What it turns out that most founders do, including me, like when I started, I did the exact same thing. We don't even start thinking about MVPs in terms of riskiest assumption. We start on the MVP side. Typically we end up starting by building a beta. We build some simple version of a product, right? And then when we think about our riskiest assumption, we sort of rationalize and tell ourselves, oh, well, I'm testing, can I solve the problem? And you can see there's a couple of problems here. First is that an automated solution software, a beta version of software, will not answer the question most efficiently, can you solve the problem? So this is inherently not a match, these two. All right, this is not, a beta solution is not the least effortful way to test, can you solve this problem? So here's a problem right here. So if you're having problems figuring out what features to add, or it's taking too long to build your MVP, this is why. Because there's not an alignment between these two things that you need, your riskiest assumption and your MVP. And the other thing that we're going to talk about is that this is probably not your riskiest assumption. Right? There's probably an assumption that's riskier than this one. So it turns out assumptions come in a riskiest order. I used to think, and a number of us who teach Lean Startup used to think that it was up to a founder and the founding team to decide what the riskiest assumption is. After having done this process with my own companies and working with literally hundreds of startups, I now know that there is a most efficient order to go and test these assumptions. So you don't actually have to worry about figuring out what your riskiest assumption is. I'm going to tell you what your riskiest assumption is right now. All right, so your assumptions go in riskiness order, starting with, can you find people who are already trying to solve the problem that your product wants to solve? That's your riskiest assumption. After that, your riskiest assumption is, do they want your help solving it? After that is, will they pay you to solve it? Not will they pay someone else, but will they pay you to solve it? And then, can you solve it? So can you solve it comes fourth. And finally, once you solve it, will you achieve product market fit? All right, so these are the assumptions in order. And of course, each of them has a corresponding test that can be used to determine the answer to these questions. Now, the relationship between these assumptions is really kind of beautiful because they build on top of each other. And this is why I can tell you that this is the most efficient way to actually test your assumptions. So we'll start at the end. Obviously, your goal is to achieve product market fit. But of course, you won't be able to achieve product market fit unless you can actually solve the problem. So that's sort of a given. Okay, great. So if we know that that's true, we also know that it won't be worth solving the problem if people won't pay you to solve the problem. Solving a problem is only worth it if you're going to get what you need to achieve product market fit by doing so. So before we test can you solve it, you need to test, will people pay for the solution? And of course, we know that people won't pay for a solution if they don't want your help solving it. So no one's going to give you money if they don't want your help solving the problem. So we're going to test that first. And then of course, we won't be able to tell if people want your help solving a problem if we can't find people who are already trying to solve the problem. So by starting in this order, we can test your riskiest assumption, and then any data we get fills in and builds on the next assumption and the next assumption and the next assumption. All right, and like I said, each of these has a corresponding MVP. The one I've added here is for customer interviews. We don't typically consider that an MVP, but all the rest of the MVPs that we've talked about. Okay, so now you know what your riskiest assumption is. So your riskiest assumption is the assumption here that you have not tested yet. So which of these tests have you not validated? And remember, you probably want to go in order, because just because you've built a beta product does not necessarily mean that you've found product market fit. So if you've built a beta product but you haven't actually confirmed that you can find people who are actively trying to solve the problem, that means that A, you probably don't have people using your beta product, and you definitely don't have people paying for it. So what you want to do is you want to go back here and you want to see if you can find people who are already trying to solve the problem with customer interviews. All right, so figure out which one of these you haven't done, which assumption have you not validated, and that is your corresponding MVP. That's where you need to be building. So now you know your risky assumption and which MVP to build, but you still don't know how to build it. How to build the MVP that's going to test your riskiest assumption. That is where tool number 8 comes in. So our final tool is the Focus Framework. The Focus Framework is a 5 workbook series, and those 5 workbooks correspond to these 5 assumptions. So let's take a look at this first one. Can you find people already trying to solve the problem? People who are already trying to solve the problem that your product wants to solve, those are considered early adopters. And the first book is called Finding Early Adopters. The test that we run, just like we talked about before, is customer interviews. So this workbook is going to show you exactly how to do customer interviews. So it's going to help you figure out who you should interview, how you find them, how you ask for interviews, what you ask, and what you do with the answers. It'll also tell you when you're done interviewing and when you can move on to the next step, which is, do the early adopters want your help solving the problem? So you can't ask them during interviews. So you ask them by offering a solution. you'll go back and you'll identify a channel and a marketing message, and you will offer a solution to the problem, and you see if they take you up on that offer. So again, this is going to be ads or cold emails for B2B sales. You'll offer a solution to someone via cold email, and you'll see if they take you up on that offer. The offer testing workbook will walk you through exactly how to do that, as well as to determine whether or not the size of this opportunity is large enough for it to be worth it for you to go and achieve product market fit. All right, so once you've done your offer testing, you'll move on to will they pay you to solve the problem. So here, it's a workbook called currency testing, because currency represents not only cash, but anything of value you need to go and achieve your product market fit. And this workbook is going to show you all about landing page testing, pre-sales, letter of intent. It's going to show you about price testing, total lifetime value. It's going to tell you all that good stuff. How to build your MVPs, how to test them, how to put success metrics around them, and how to know when it's time to move on to the next assumption, which is, can you solve the problem? So notice that, can you solve the problem? This is the fourth assumption that we're going to test. And it's the fourth workbook. So again, this is where most people start, but we actually want to start with all these other steps instead. Once we get here, we're going to do a phase called utility testing. This is testing whether or not you can actually provide utility to your customer. So we measure that by actually creating a manual solution. So this workbook is going to tell you exactly how to create a manual solution, what features you should put in there first, which ones you should put in last, and then how much time and energy you should put in building this thing manually and solving the problem manually before you move on to testing the next assumption, which is, will you be able to achieve product market fit? So this workbook is called Scaling to Fit. And this is where you start actually automating your solution with a beta piece of software, and then you start testing secondary segments, secondary channels, etc. So now you can see where the focus framework gets its name. It's from each of these steps within the validation process. And really what the focus framework does best is it shows you how to find product market fit. All right, before you go, I just want to ask if you think this video would be helpful for a friend. If you have a friend who might benefit from watching this video, would you do me and hopefully them a favor, and would you share it with them? So you can share it on Facebook or Twitter, or just send them an email. Like I said, hopefully you'll be doing them a favor, but you'll also definitely be doing me a favor, because I love creating these videos, and the more people who watch them, the more excuse I have to go and make them.